Care Home Liaison Service. So, like our other webinars, folks have submitted questions in advance, and that's given Melissa and Kerry an opportunity to think about answers and responses for you. So they've actually got a set of slides and presentations to be able to run through with you this afternoon. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end, 5-10 minutes, to be able to gather in any other questions that you might have for us. But I'm going to pass you on now to Melissa and Kerry to take forward their presentation. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everybody. First of all, we'd just like to say thank you for attending today and for submitting the questions. Kerry and I have had a look over them over the last few days, and they've been really interesting, and hopefully it'll be an interesting discussion this afternoon. If we can ask you to just hold on to any supplementary questions you might have during the presentation, and then hopefully we can make time at the end to answer those. We're just conscious of the fact we've only got 45 minutes and there's lots of questions to try and get through, so we're going to do our best to get through as many as we can this afternoon for you. Okay? So just to run through the aims of today's session. So we want to be addressing as many questions as possible regarding the management of stress and distress behaviour during COVID-19, introduce some of the concepts outlined in Glasgow City HSCP care home guidance that Kerry and I, along with other colleagues, produced, which were looking specifically at supporting symptomatic residents living with dementia who have to self-isolate, and then maybe to provide some suggestions as to how to look after yourselves during COVID-19. Okay, so just a little bit of context. Currently there's a huge challenge in supporting symptomatic residents living with dementia that are having to self-isolate, and this may include already tested positive and must remain in the care home, but also maybe those who are symptomatic having received a formal diagnosis. At present, there's an increased likelihood of some residents who are showing signs of distress who are required to self-isolate in the rooms of wandering outside their rooms, which increases the risk to themselves and to others because of cross-contamination. As a result, care staff may have quite significant anxieties about their own health, about their family, about those they love and care for. And during this difficult and challenging time, you may experience a range of emotions, including feeling very overwhelmed and stressed. And this is completely understandable during the current time and probably very common amongst your teams at the moment. We're now going to move on to the question and answer part of the webinar. I'm hoping you can see our presentation, although we can't see it on the screen at the moment. But if you can't, we'll make it accessible to you after, so you'll be able to access the slides. Great, thank you. So if we just go down to the first question, which is slide 4. And I'll just read that question out. So, is there any guidance from the Mental Welfare Commission regarding the ethical dilemma on restraining people living with dementia in their room if they're symptomatic? Okay. Supporting residents to stay in their rooms if they've got symptoms is really, really challenging because staff obviously want to try and reduce the spread of the virus, so this can be really, really difficult. And residents living in care homes retain their human rights, their full human rights, unless these have been restricted by a legal process, and then only to the extent allowed by law according to the Mental Welfare Commission. And the use of restrictive interventions must be considered reasonable, proportionate, the least restrictive method, and of the shortest duration possible. The intervention must be weighed up against the risks and only used if it's agreed as part of if we could consider it to be in the residents' best interests. This needs to be agreed with the care home staff, the family and the medical team involved, and written very clearly in their care plan. The Mental Welfare Commission have a really helpful website with lots and lots of resources and comprehensive guidance as to the use of restraints for care home residents. And we've put the link to their website at the very end of our presentation. Their website also has a really useful kind of advice note, which is updated weekly during COVID, which details the kind of, outlines the general principles of good practice and human rights, and offers the most up-to-date advice regarding that. So I really encourage you all to access that website. And as I said earlier, Kerry and I, along with another colleague from the Older People Psychology Service, have produced a set of guidelines on how we can support symptomatic patients or residents with that are showing signs of distress, and we've made that available to each of the 5 care homes. We hope you've had access to that. We've asked for staff to keep them in the staff areas, so duty office and staff office. It's not to be used in clinical areas at the moment due to the infection control, but this set of guidelines offers kind of a list of common difficulties that you might come across at the moment. It also looks at unmet needs and how you might start to address or meet some of these needs too. It includes different scenarios, so maybe when a loved one is asking for a family member, or perhaps when they're trying to leave their room, or maybe when staff feel that that particular resident would benefit from engaging in a meaningful activity or some kind of occupation. So I'm not going to go into detail about those today because they're in that guidance and you can refer to that, but it will go through different scenarios which hopefully you can find helpful. And of course, whilst every attempt will be made by you guys and the care staff to de-escalate distress, there might be a time where further support is needed. And if this is the case, then you'll need to contact the GP to start with, and they'll kind of do the restraints such as medication will need to be discussed with the medical team, and again, where appropriate, with family members, clearly written in the care plan. But what we think is most important, what we need to do initially, is try to understand what the distress is about in the first instance. Try to understand what the resident's trying to communicate. That would be of primary importance and needs to be done prior to you contacting the duty desk or the older people's community mental health team for advice. So just making sure you're ruling out any reversible causes, linking in with the guidance we've set, and then obviously if all that doesn't lower someone's distress, then maybe linking to the community care, the care home liaison service or the community team. Okay. So the next question was around ethical dilemmas again. So if we could just move on to the next slide. So would we be ethically allowed to isolate the residents in their rooms who are not displaying distress behaviours to ensure that their safety against symptomatic resident living with dementia who is unable to isolate in their own rooms? Okay, and that's a really interesting question. It's quite a difficult one to answer really because each situation is different and we need to consider each case individually. But for me and for my colleagues, I think the most appropriate way forward in this particular incident would be to try, wherever possible, to support the resident with symptoms to try and stay in their own room. And I know that comes with lots and lots of challenges. But again, just trying to understand why they're wanting to leave their room, as any kind of movement or activity is usually purposeful. So you should be able to kind of work out what it is that why they wanted to leave the room. Consider what the unmet need is, and try and meet this. And if you can't meet the unmet need, can we try and consider finding an alternative or substituting that need? So for example, in the evening, I might sit on my sofa watching telly, and during the course of the evening, I might get up several times. And that's not without purpose. I might get up to get myself a drink if I'm thirsty, I might want to go to the toilet, or I might be just going to find a family member. And that's no different for someone with dementia. So just trying to understand what they're trying to get up for and why they want to leave might help you just think about how you're best to support them. Again, going back to the basics of trying to engage them in a meaningful activity or engaging them in a conversation which might be of interest to them might help to divert their attention away from wanting to leave their room. The Learning Disability Service has also produced some really excellent resources that are aphasia friendly and also pictorial. So you could use these to see if it aids people's understandings of why they have to self-isolate. And the link again for this particular resource is included in not only the care home guidance, but also we put it at the end of this presentation too. And I'd really recommend that you access those resources because they really are very, very good. It's not practical or ethical to ask residents who are not distressed or have symptoms to stay in their room for long periods. They may be happy to stay in their room for brief periods, but we were unable to really ask them to stay in the rooms if they don't wish to. This is really difficult to manage, especially if the resident decides to change their mind and want to leave kind of after half an hour or so. And what we need to consider is, if we're considering this as an alternative intervention, then this could actually increase the distress for that particular resident who isn't showing signs of distress or symptoms in the long term. So it wouldn't be considered in their best interest, and it wouldn't be considered reasonable or appropriate. It could also be maybe considered as an infringement of their human rights too, so it can't really be enforced. And again, just referring back to the Mental Welfare Commissioning team, they have a really useful document called Rights, Risks and Limits to Freedom. And again, that can be really easily accessed through their website. And that gives really detailed, up-to-date advice on the use of restrictive interventions for care home residents. And again, you know, if you do have concerns, you can always contact the duty desk to talk through those with them. So just moving on to the next slide then. The most appropriate way forward, let's have a quick look. So the next kind of question on ethical concerns is sedation going to be more readily used during the pandemic as a last resort? And what are the legal implications regarding this? Okay. So assessing risk is very different at the moment during COVID, given the situation we're in. And the risk threshold is very different for residents wandering around that are symptomatic, as that not only increases the risk to themselves, it also increases the risk to care staff and also other residents. But our advice would kind of remain the same, which would be to rule out the reversible causes first, because if their distress has a sudden onset, then it's most likely to be something physical that you can rule out. And then once this has been ruled out and the distress still remains, consider using proactive measures, and then maybe to consider the wide range of non-pharmacological interventions that are outlined in the care home guidance. But either way, it's really important when we are faced with many different ethical dilemmas that we try and get some kind of clarity in our own mind about things, about how to kind of manage someone's distress, what measures are the most appropriate, what's the most appropriate course of action to take to manage someone's distress. But if staff feel as though sedation might only be the only option because they've tried everything else, so it's a last resort, this does need to be really discussed with the medical team. Clearly written in the care plan, and then only used when absolutely necessary and when the risk to the patient or the resident in question, and that all other interventions have been tried beforehand without success. So we just move on to the next question then, Shirley-Ann. Thank you. So safe to wander guidelines are at present ethically problematic, with fire compartments closed off and doors closed to restrict residents' movements. Okay. So our understanding is that fire compartments are designed to keep residents safe from a potential fire, and therefore shouldn't really be used for any other purposes. And the risk of closing a fire door far outweigh the risk of someone wandering, even those with symptoms. I feel this is kind of slightly out of our remit in terms of advising around fire safety, so I'd probably recommend when those kind of questions come up, maybe to link in or contact the local fire department, who will be able to advise you much better than we will on the safety issues around that. But again, if this particular question relates to issues that are arising regarding residents wanting to leave their room or the unit, then as we mentioned earlier, it'd be important in the first instance to just try and understand what it is they're wanting to leave their room for, because this might be really easily managed. It may well be they're just looking for a drink, or maybe they're looking for a loved one. And if you can't meet that need, then you'll need to just think about a more creative way in which you might be able to substitute that. So for example, if they're leaving to find a family member, maybe consider using an iPad or supporting them to have a live video call or a phone call with their loved one, or maybe a pre-recorded message on the iPad if that person, is showing distress repeatedly. And playing kind of pre-recorded messages on an iPad of a loved one or family member can be really, really helpful and very reassuring for residents who are distressed We might be just looking for that bit of company. So just moving on to the next question then. So if residents are displaying distress and distressed behaviours and we have no powers to retain them in the care home and it is assessed as safe to let them out, will the police be able to return them to the care home? Okay. I think this situation is probably, hopefully, very rare, but really in the first instance what we'd be again trying to do is trying to understand why that resident has wanted to leave the care home, because it could be easily addressed. Trying to work out what they're trying to communicate, and I guess a lot of today will feel a bit repetitive, but it's really important we're trying to kind of drive home this key message of following these particular steps, because if they're at the forefront of your mind when you're busy at work and you intervene early with these steps, then you're likely to kind of reduce the level of distress quite quickly, hopefully for someone. But if this particular resident has capacity, then maybe we can think about whether it's appropriate to have a conversation with them around the government's advice on social isolation and not leaving the home. Could they understand that? Could you have that kind of conversation with the resident? But if they've got cognitive difficulties or comprehension difficulties, then maybe consider using that aphasia-friendly resource pack we talked about earlier on, or even using some pictorial communication cards with that particular resident. But if the resident has long-standing mental health issues and no dementia, then staff really need to be in contact with the care home liaison team and anticipate this as a potential risk, rather than waiting for it to happen. And again, a clear plan agreed with the care home liaison team needs to be written in the care plan for that particular resident and agreed by all relevant staff. But if the resident does leave, as they're able to, and fails to return in the normal agreed hours, then of course just follow the agreed steps of the care plan and contact the police to bring them home if that's what you would do normally. So just moving on to the next question. So I'm going to pass over to Kerry here to answer those.
Just welcome to the homes that weren't with us at the start. Thanks for tuning in. We're going through all the questions just now, and if you have supplementary questions, they can be asked at the end. We'll have a short time to cover those, hopefully. So on to the next question. Is there a quick referral process to CPNs and psychology during this pandemic, and what would that pathway look like? The quick answer to that is to say that our referral process is exactly the same. I've done an infographic here just to talk through that referral process as a refresher, but also to talk about the supports available for staff during the pandemic. I should also say that our community psychiatric nurses are working really hard at the moment to try and keep in touch with all the care homes just to provide informal support and advice regarding resident distress. And I know that they're just trying to maintain that regular contact over the phone given the visiting restrictions. But obviously as things progress they hope to use video calls as well in this way to offer advice if necessary. So obviously that will progress over time, but they are trying very much so to stay in touch with you. So looking at this infographic, on the left hand side we have a pyramid looking at resident distress, and Melissa's already mentioned the steps that you might like to work through if a resident is distressed in your care home. So first of all you would want to screen for any reversible physical causes and delirium, and obviously within that during this time you would want to test for COVID as well if it was suspected. You would want to liaise with the patient's GP to see if there was any underlying infection such as a urinary infection, and also monitor things like fluid, food intake, any pain, is the patient on adequate analgesia, bill monitoring, any medication side effects, all the things that you're doing routinely, you would still do those in the same way. And I'll talk a bit about delirium further on in another question. The step after that would be looking at what we call in psychology proactive intervention. And it's really your basic care strategies that you're all putting in place day to day. So imagine a resident who is distressed during personal care. Proactive and preventative strategies might be things like introducing yourself beforehand, making sure that there's maybe a visual cue to help them understand that personal care is going to take place, like showing them some soap or a towel beforehand, maybe distracting them by putting on some nice music that they like. These kind of things can really help minimise the stress proactively, so that the patient's distress is not escalating, and this is what we call proactive and preventative strategies. If those things aren't working and a resident is distressed and it's distressing other residents or it's putting staff at risk, you might then want to contact the care home liaison team duty desk just for some advice really on what to do. After that discussion, that might be enough, but after that, if that isn't sufficient, you might then want to refer on to the care home liaison team, and a formal referral would be submitted via the GP. I work in the northwest locality, and I know from speaking to my colleagues that they've been trying to screen referrals quickly and just contact you as soon as the referral comes in, so I hope that's true of all the localities. I'll talk through staff support. So first of all, just to say that at the moment it's a very, very stressful time for staff, and I want to acknowledge that. Thank you to all for being in the homes right now. Really appreciate our residents. Just to say, I think it's great at the moment if culture of speaking about how you're feeling and acknowledging the pressures that you're under with your peers and providing that peer support, but also senior management as well. So if your senior colleagues can look at shift patterns, access to PPE, and these kind of things can really help reduce distress or anxiety or feeling overwhelmed. I think once you finish the working day, I know it's hard, but trying to unwind, shut off from your work and find things that you enjoy is also really important to maintain your physical and mental well-being. I've added a link into the presentation which will be sent round for an online stress control class. It's run by a Glasgow-based I'll just let everybody. Okay, I think I hear one of the homes, but I think that's it now. Thank you. So just to repeat,
I muted them. Sorry.
Thank you. Shirley Ann's muted you, so thanks for that for now. It's just a bit of interference at our side. So just to say, I've put on a link for this free stress control class that you can access if you wish, but also to say you have access to the Health and Social Care Partnership phone line, which is available to all staff working in GG&C for confidential support. It's open Monday to Friday, 8 AM till 6 PM, and I've put the number in the presentation. Okay. So on to the next slide. If you can't see it, I'll just refer to it. It's a poster which has been developed by our colleague Dr. Holly Thompson, who's a clinical psychologist, and it's looking at proactive and preventative strategies. So these things I mentioned earlier to try and help you minimise distress so that it doesn't escalate. This poster has been sent around all the hubs, so you should have access to it already, but please let us know if you don't. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question now. Is virtual information sharing session meetings an option going forward to design formulations to support a care plan? I think that's a really good question. Really nice to see that you're interested in doing information sharing sessions at the moment, and the answer to that in short is absolutely yes, it is possible. I think it's an excellent option for key people involved in a resident's care to connect together and share ideas to guide a formulation and intervention plan to manage their distress. Virtual sessions can be held with our care home liaison nurses, so they can lead an information sharing session over a video call, but that will obviously depend on technology. Janice was just saying there that you may have access to Microsoft Teams, and that's the technology that we're using in the NHS at the moment. So when you do have access to that, that compatibility might mean that these can take place. And a positive step is that we've already had these information sharing sessions happen in some localities in ward-based settings, so we know it is possible, and I think it's a really positive way of moving forward given this is likely to go on for some time. Okay, so on to the next question. I know that we're going really fast, I'm just conscious of time. So are there beds available in acute wards for residents even if delirium due to COVID-19? My understanding is that bed availability is assessed on a case-by-case basis. It's important to note though that people living with dementia, as you know, will be more vulnerable to delirium, particularly if they're testing positive for COVID-19, if they've got an underlying infection. So it's really important that you're still screening for delirium and being aware of the different types. So we know with hyperactive types of delirium, residents are more likely to become restless, sometimes paranoid, more agitated in presentation. With hypoactive delirium, so instead of hyperactive we have hypoactive, residents may become abnormally drowsy, a bit dazed, reduced activity levels, so an acute shift in how they would normally be. And then we've got mixed presentations as well, which are a lot harder to spot, and these residents will fluctuate between hyperactive and hypoactive states. I think the main thing is if you suspect or you notice that a resident is acutely confused, matching one of these presentations, contact their GP for necessary tests. If they are showing symptoms of COVID-19, making sure you're testing and monitoring the usual things like pain levels, bowel charts, food and fluid intake, etc. There's recent guidance from the British Geriatric Society on managing delirium in confirmed and suspected COVID cases. I've put the link at the end of this presentation for you to gain access to that, because that's the most up-to-date guidance. Obviously for medical management you might want to contact the GP but also the care home liaison team, and there's simple strategies that you can use as well for people that are delirious, like orientation and promoting sleep hygiene. These things will really help with recovery, but ultimately you want to get to the underlying physical cause. Okay, so just moving on to the next question, and it's about signage. So what signage can you suggest that would help distressed residents? I think clear and high contrast signage is always encouraged to orientate residents with dementia, and I think from being in quite a few of the hubs, I think you already have some really great signage, particularly for things like the kitchen, the sitting room, these kind of things, just to help orientate your residents. However, at the moment you might want to consider additional signage, pictorial resources or social stories, to help residents understand things like social distancing, staff wearing masks, hand washing, COVID testing, because I imagine it's quite distressing for patients if they're to get a swab. So trying to communicate these ideas via pictorial resources or signage can be really helpful. On to the next slide, we have just put up a few visual images of pictorial cue cards that can be helpful in supporting communication with residents. So Melissa mentioned already the aphasia friendly website, and I've put a link onto this because they have really good COVID information cards that can be downloaded for free and adapted for your residents. So this might be for residents that are non-verbal. You can just use pictorial cards, you know, if they're feeling if you're wanting to monitor symptoms with them, they might be able to point to if they're cold or if they're too hot. These kind of things, really helpful method of communication. You might want to enlarge images for residents with visual impairments, and obviously laminate as well for infection control purposes. Keeping them accessible is important because for patients with residents with memory problems, you might have to repeat the message a few times before they understand or repeat it several times during the day. So having these kind of things laminated and in a folder that you can repeatedly communicate ideas can be really helpful. Okay, so I'm just going to pass back to Melissa and she's going to go through some questions on supporting social distancing.
Okay, so when we received the questions from Janice, we tried to kind of lump them into different themes. So these ones are questions that are relating to supporting social distancing. So the first one relates to a scenario. So 3 residents within the dementia unit are friends and enjoy sitting together for tea or walking around the unit together. Although staff encourage self-distance between them, this can trigger distress, including shouting out at a member of staff who's trying to distract one person away to social distance. Okay. So it's really important that to kind of bear in mind that people living with dementia may not be able to understand the importance or the reason for social distancing. Again, we've talked about the aphasia-friendly resources, so you could try using this kind of pictorial communication system or communication cards to try and explain to the residents or the residents in this particular scenario around the importance of social distancing. They're very, very user-friendly and they've been produced, these aphasia-friendly resources have been produced for a wide range of people with communication difficulties, including people with learning disabilities, and can also be used for people where maybe English isn't their first language too. But the key thing here is really to intervene early and think very proactively about an alternative. So again, going back to the basics, we're trying to drive home that message in terms of consider, you know, have you ruled out all the physical causes? Have you considered what the unmet need might be? So for instance, unmet need could be one of social contact, it could be one of occupation, or it could be maybe just seeking comfort. And if you can't meet that need, we look to substitute it in the best way we possibly can. So for example, just running through a couple of options, if the unmet need is one of social contact, then could staff provide one-to-one support maybe for short periods for that particular resident, or could they organise a video call with a family member? If the unmet need is one of occupation, for example, they're wanting to drink tea with the other residents because that's what they normally would do, could staff just make more of an event of this in their bedroom? Or support them to video call the other residents, if that's appropriate, the ones that they would normally have tea with. And maybe comfort as an unmet need is something we see quite regularly, it's quite common. Could you consider ways in which you could still offer closeness and touch to that particular resident showing signs of distress? Maybe consider providing a hand massage if it's safe to do so, a manicure or brushing someone's hair, maybe when the resident isn't symptomatic. Those kind of ways of supporting the unmet need around comfort can be incredibly powerful, incredibly helpful and very reassuring to the resident and can lower distress if we intervene early. And also, can you think creatively about ways in which you could create distance? So for example, having a large table between residents with place settings spaced out, and maybe introduce an activity or offer occupation with a clear endpoint. So just to move on to the next question. Residents who test positive for COVID-19, how do we isolate if the person does not understand what is happening? Again, a lot of it's down to comprehension and what they're able to understand, you know, their level of cognitive impairment. So again, in the first instance, I would always recommend that you're trying to understand what it is that person wants, what they're trying to communicate, why they're trying to leave. As we said earlier, all actions have a purpose, so people don't just get up for no reason. Behaviour isn't complex, it's quite simple and it's always purposeful. Again, just going back to the basics, remembering, you know, have you ruled out pain? Could they be hungry, thirsty? Are they bored? Are they starting to get stiff? Do they need to get up and move around? Or are they just looking for company? And use materials to try and communicate simply what's going on. So again, using those pictorial resources Kerry showed earlier on the slides, and seeing whether or not that aids communication and aids understanding. Try not to argue or get into a battle or reason with the resident, because that can lead to further distress. So, for example, avoid telling them what they can't do. So, for example, you know, it's not necessarily helpful to say, "Oh, Betty, you're not allowed to see your friend today." Maybe try kind of focus on what they are able to do. So, having tea in their bedroom, linking in with their friends via a video call, ringing their family, as that's likely to help reduce some of the distress they're experiencing. Trying to create some sense of normality is hugely important, because keeping some kind of structure and routine can be very reassuring in these difficult times, because there's a lot of uncertainty around for not only residents but for care staff too. And if you're able to kind of maintain some kind of normality, that can be hugely helpful. And I guess you're all doing this already anyway, but it's just to reiterate the importance of approaching a resident in a friendly manner. Smiling can offer a lot of reassurance to someone feeling distressed, and if you intervene early, that can lower the distress. And then maybe consider the use of validation or distraction, and consider whether or not you're able to support the resident to engage in a meaningful activity if time permits and there's enough resources there. Okay, so just moving on to the second question in the social distancing section. One resident is unable to understand why she's not allowed to sit beside her friend due to social distancing. Staff have tried various distraction techniques, including playing music, talking and listening, but none of that's been helpful. And the separation is attributed to her distress. Okay, so whilst we know that distraction can be really helpful in some situations, it's not always appropriate and not always helpful. And sometimes we have a tendency, especially when we're really busy, to use distraction techniques which might have worked for other residents or may have worked with that particular resident in the past. However, when it comes to using distraction or any kind of intervention really, it's really important to make sure that they're meaningful to that person. To mute to home, because I'm getting a little bit of interference. Is that looks like it's working now? Thank you. Whilst we'd be normally recommending distraction as a later strategy, consideration needs to be given to start with before you're thinking about distraction and validation to again what that unmet need might be. And I'm sure that you're all doing this already and have really good ideas around what's causing distress for that person. Again, you can just refer to the care home guidance that we mentioned earlier that you should all have access to, which will provide detailed advice with regards to different scenarios that you might come across when somebody is showing signs of distress. Could staff maybe sit with that particular resident and offer one-to-one support to meet that kind of social interaction or social contact need that they might have? Again, avoid talking about what they can't do. Try and focus on things that are of interest to them, focus on things that they are able to do and can be supported to do. And maybe try and engage them in meaningful activity or occupation. So for instance, could you consider using a rummage box or having access to reminiscence book for them, making sure that's accessible for them, or maybe looking through old family photos. All of these kind of ideas can be hugely helpful to people that are showing signs of distress. Okay, we're now going to just move on to visiting restrictions, so I'm going to pass you over to Kerry for that.
Hi again, everyone. So our next question is, a resident who did always have daily visits from her husband is very low in mood and doesn't understand why she hasn't seen or had a visit from her family. How can we explain and reassure her? I think this is an excellent question because I imagine you're having a similar experience with residents across your care homes. I suppose, first of all, in terms of explaining visiting restrictions to residents, again, you might want to use some of the pictorial resources that we mentioned earlier. Give those a try, but it'll really depend on a resident's level of understanding. So if this woman has memory problems, you may have to find a simple and consistent way of communicating the message among the care team, so that if you're repeating the message several times a day between staff, you have the same message of why her husband isn't coming to visit her anymore, because if she hears lots of mixed messages, that can be quite confusing, I imagine, and it might be more distressing for her. So I think that's the first thing, trying to find a consistent message and to find a way of communicating it, and maybe using some of these pictorial resources. I guess the second thing is that this resident, like all of us, has things that she needs in order to maintain her emotional well-being. And one of those clearly is to have a connection with her family, as it's likely to provide her with comfort, familiarity, and a feeling of safety. So for all of us at the moment, I know for myself, you know, we're being challenged by the restrictions that are being put upon us. We can't always have physical contact with our family or our friends, and that's tough, you know, and does have an impact on us emotionally. And I'm sure you'll all agree that we've had to find ways of communicating. Even being here today and doing this over video, we're trying to connect in different ways from how we did before. And I imagine you're trying to support that in the homes as much as you can for residents, and that's what I would actively encourage, that, you know, for this resident, can we think about ways of maintaining that connection with her husband? So you might not be able to visit physically, but can they have a video call? I should say that video calls might be more distressing for residents, because they might think, oh, this is quite unusual, I'm missing my husband and he's on a screen. A telephone call might fit better for them. Obviously that can be quite a burden for her husband if she's forgetting they've just been on the phone, and you know, our memory is not great. So an idea we would have is to have a pre-recorded message from her husband that potentially you can play several times during the day. So if she has forgotten that she's just heard from him on the phone, you could play this again to reassure her. So just a method to aid her memory. But obviously you would need to have the husband on board with that and him to send something in to you. I suppose if none of that is possible, you might try and substitute her need for connection, and that might be trying to provide comfort by having more one-to-one time with the resident, if that's possible. It might be other comforting activities. Melissa's mentioned earlier about a hand massage, these kind of things, if that's possible. But also maybe providing her with a familiar object from home. I had written on the slide a blanket, but obviously if that was brought in infection control purposes right now, I don't know if that is the best idea. But if I know in the hospital there's been kind of a drop-off service where things can be disinfected and passed on to patients, so I wonder if the same could happen for residents, maybe something familiar to them that will give them a sense of comfort, like photographs, whatever else. So yeah, a good question, and I think it's about thinking innovatively about maintaining the connection during this time. So on to the next scenario. Melissa will answer this one for you.
I think this is the final question of today's session, so hopefully we'll have some time after this one for some supplementary questions or anything else you want to clarify with us. So the final question is, how do we keep a resident in their bedroom who has dementia? She's deaf and also has a learning disability and tested COVID positive. She's displaying stress and distress behaviours and was also distressed when staff and nurses entered her room with masks on, as she is unable to understand or lip read. So how do we manage this as she doesn't understand? It is there to protect herself and the other residents. And just a supplementary note, she lost her sister and was in emergency admission last year and doesn't always like to be on her own in the bedroom. Okay. So given this lady has a learning disability, again, the aphasia pictorial resources are going to be hugely important here. They have different scenarios, so there'll be one looking at how do you explain to someone that they've tested positive for COVID. So I would really recommend that you access those particular ones.
Somebody should it be necessary, and I don't think they can really answer it because people.
Okay.
There, sorry.
And again, like I said earlier on, these, I think there was another question we had quite late in the day, but it was around when English isn't somebody's first language. Again, you can use these pictorial resources with people that English isn't their first language to explain, you know, if they've tested positive or the importance of social isolation and social distancing. And as I said, they're very, very accessible. We've put the link at the end of this presentation for you. But with this particular lady with learning disability and communication difficulties, using non-verbal communication would be essential here. So nodding, smiling, trying to acknowledge that you've understood or heard what she's saying, and being mindful of body language as well. So could you, lean into her, nod. It's just being mindful of all those kind of non-verbal body language kind of things that we can use to aid communication. And with regards to her not liking being on her own in her own room since the death of her sister, again, could we, if possible, could staff provide some one-to-one time for her for short periods, so she's got that kind of comfort or that contact with people? Could staff also think about how she could be stimulated during times when you're not able to be present for her in a room because you're all very busy? Could she be engaged in something that might help her to feel more stimulated? Maybe, again, referring back to what we were saying earlier on about, has she got access to a rummage box? Could she look through her old photos? Could staff support her to use the outside space if possible and safe to do so? So I think this is we've come to the end of our presentation. I think we've hopefully gone through as many questions as we received. I'm not sure how we're doing for time and whether or not...
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, great. So these are the kind of resources that Kerry's just put on the presentation. This is the Mental Welfare Commissioning website. So again, if you want to go and look at anything to do with using restrictive interventions or good principle guidelines, then that's the website you'd link into. And as I said, they have that advice note which is updated weekly with very, very current advice on what to do with residents in care homes that are having to self-isolate and using those restrictive methods. And we've also included, as I said, all the other websites that we've mentioned today. So I don't know whether or not there's any quick questions that anybody has that we might be able to answer for you. If not, feel free to email them to Janice, who could then forward them on to us so we can respond by email.
So if there's any other questions, if you want to raise your hand and we can take you off mute, if there's any extra questions this afternoon. No,
Okay.
Seeing anything extra. Okay, that's great.
So it looks like there isn't any supplementary questions. Apologies if somebody has got their hand up and we can't see you. But I just want to say on behalf of me and Kerry, thank you very much for all attending today, because I know how busy you all are. And really a big thank you also for those that submitted questions for us to think about and discuss today. And we hope you found, hopefully our presentation helpful, and you'll be able to take some ideas forward and have some ideas about where to link in to get more guidance and advice. So thank you.